Today we're going to bring our Ender 3 V2 series and our Klipper series together and configure this printer to run Klipper. Hello everyone, Chris here, and yes, today we are going to get Klipper up and running on our Ender 3 V2. Now, over the last couple of weeks we've done a lot. We got our BL Touch installed on our V2, we updated the firmware to the newest version of Marlin, we've also done a base Klipper install with Octoprint, as well as checked out Mainsail and Fluid. We're going to put a lot of that together today and actually get Klipper up and running on a 3D printer where it can print something. Now, there's a lot to this, so you're going to have some of the knowledge that we gained in the previous videos, like setting up your Raspberry Pi to run Klipper, but I'll leave a link to all of that in the description below. And the good thing is, Klipper already has a great example configuration for the Ender 3 V2. Most of it is already there, so we can start with a base, but we'll also talk about what you would have to do if you needed to do one from scratch. I'll point you to the documentation and show you what a lot of this means. So let's not waste any time, let's dig right into the config and see what we have to do to get up and printing on our Ender 3 V2. And just to level set us a little bit, I do have my Raspberry Pi with a fresh install of Mainsail. I haven't done any of the configuration yet, and we will need another SD card of some type so that we can get our Klipper bin file, our firmware.bin file, over to the printer. So let's start by taking a look at that default Ender 3 V2 config for Klipper. Just like in the Mainsail video, since we already have it up and running, we can just open our browser and we can head to mainsail.local. Again, this is a completely vanilla configuration. I haven't done anything other than make that image on an SD card and power the Pi up. So we have a lot of configuration to do. But just checking out the example config is going to help you a lot in to know what to do to how to configure Klipper for this 3D printer. So if we just go to Machine, up here, we'll open up Config Examples. There's 179 in here. Just keep scrolling till you find one that's relatively close to your machine. And here's one for Printer Creality Ender 3 V2 2020. That should be close enough to our printer configuration where it's going to work for us. Remember, there are multiple boards for some of these printers, like the V2, but hopefully, again, it's close enough we can make it work. So we'll start here. And up here in the comments, this gives you a lot of information that you would need to do your make config to create your Klipper bin file. This is the file that goes on your main board that allows you to start using Klipper. But this will ultimately be our Printer.cfg. So I'm just going to Control A to select all of this and Control C to copy it. So we can close this for now. And then I'll go back to config up here in the pull down, and I'm just going to create a new file. And we're going to call it Printer.cfg. We'll open that up and we'll paste in our example config. This is going to be our base config to get us started. We can go ahead and leave this up for now because we're going to need a lot of this information when we head over to command line to go ahead and compile Klipper. So I'm going to open up Putty and I'm going to head over to mainsail.local so that we can interact with a Raspberry Pi via command line. And your username and password is going to be whatever you set when you created this image. That is in the previous video. From here, we can just do an ls. You can see we have a Klipper directory. We can cd into Klipper. You can do an ls again just to see what's in there. But we need to do a make menu config. Now we're going to go to the menu where we need to enter the options for our 3D printer mainboard. We can enable extra low level configuration options. We will need those. We'll kind of slide this to the side here, but you can see a lot of the information we need for this configuration is in our example config. Our architecture, we do have an STM32 processor on this printer mainboard. It is an F103. We'll have to change the bootloader offset to 28K. Clock can stay at 8 megahertz. The serial will need to be at PA10 and PA9 for this board. The baud rate at 250,000 should be just fine, and we shouldn't need any extra GPIO pins for the microcontroller startup. We should be okay for this board. So once this is done, we can hit Q to quit and yes to save. Now we can go ahead and do our compile. All you have to do is enter make. When the make is complete, you will have a Klipper.bin file. We need to get that over to an SD card so that we can load it on our printer. So we have our SD card here mounted on the PC. We're going to use WinSCP to take that file from Linux here on the Raspberry Pi over to this computer and put it on our SD card. We're going to use SCP, log into our host, mainsail.local, port 22, my username is Pied, and enter your password. And here's our Linux file system over here, our local file system on this side. So we're going to go into Klipper, we're going to go into out. And here's our Klipper.bin. We can just right click on it and hit download. And I'm just going to save it on my desktop. Back to File Explorer, I'll go to Desktop, grab my Klipper.bin and copy it. And then to my SD card, right click and paste it. And we're going to change it to Firmware.bin. Now I'm ready to mount it on my Ender 3. So we'll put in our SD card, we're going to power up and let that go ahead and flash. You will notice going over to Klipper, you're going to lose your screen. There are ways to get your screen to work with Klipper. It's a little more involved than this video is going to be, but we can investigate that later. It's not really all that useful with Klipper. I have it on other printers. Just note that if that's something you like, you're going to have to do a little extra work to get that going. And since we flashed to Klipper, we're going to go ahead and plug in our printer, USB, to our Raspberry Pi. Back to the terminal, if you do an ls/dev, you should see serial. That's how you know that your printer is communicating with your Raspberry Pi. And we need our device number for our MCU of our main board. So ls/dev/serial/by-id, and you're going to see the USB MCU number, the address. And if you just do a slash and then type in USB and hit tab, that will give you the whole device location. This is what you need in your Printer.cfg. So we'll copy this line and back to Mainsail. If you scroll down, there'll be an MCU section right here where it says serial. Paste in your new address. Now the address that we pasted is exactly what the serial was already in the example config. And that's good that they've already had that updated, but you don't ever want to assume that it's going to be the same. Not every board is going to be exactly the same. So always go get it again and make sure that it is correct. But we're good here for now. So now that we're cabled up, we can go ahead and hit save and restart. After the restart, you can see we have our MCU. It's talking to the chip on the board. So our Klipper flash was successful, and our host is in good shape. The next thing I would do from here is go ahead and do an update on Klipper. Anything that needs to be updated, Moonraker, there's a few new things from even the last time we did a video. These are supporting add-ons. Just go ahead and make sure they're all up to date. This way, if you need to update your Klipper.bin, you'll know now before we start doing any more configuration items. Now, while our Mainsail configuration is updating things, I do want to mention there's a couple of different ways that we can go here, and I want to give you all the information possible so that you can configure your 3D printer how you like. The one big thing that's going to be different is the BL Touch. There's a lot of added steps that you need to do to get your BL Touch working with Klipper. There's different configuration changes you have to make, and that can be a lot. So I'm going to save that for an additional video. It will be coming very soon, if not next week. But for this one, I'm actually going to put the Z end stop back on the printer. So it would be like a stock Ender 3 V2. And then we can tackle that BL Touch at a later date. So let's continue on from there, just like it doesn't have bed leveling. So now that everything's up to date, let's head back to the dashboard and see where we're at. The first thing you'll notice is all these missing configuration item errors here. But we are reporting correctly as far as thermistors go, so that's a good start. But let's go ahead and knock these out. If you saw the last video, pretty much all you have to do is include the mainsail.cfg to get rid of these. Because there's macros, there's things that the printer needs to know in that file, and because it's not in the Printer.cfg, it doesn't know about it. So just go back to Machine, go to your Printer.cfg, and at the top in brackets, we'll just do include Mainsail.cfg. And then you can hit save and restart. The system's back up. If you go to dashboard, all those errors are gone. So we got that knocked out of the way. From here, since we have a pretty solid example configuration, and we have a stock Ender 3 at this point, we should be able to just go through the regular testing like we do with every printer. The first thing I would do is just try to home. We can just go ahead and do home all. X and Y look good. We'll try Z. And Z home successfully. You have your motors off button here. We can use that to do our manual leveling here in a bit. Let's just try some other moves. Make sure they're operating correctly. The home all should do that for you. But we'll move Z up. Move X. Move Y. That all seems to look good. Let's go ahead and heat up the extruder. Let's do 210. And we'll do 60 on the bed. Make sure those are going to increase successfully. It looks like everything's working as expected. Let's go ahead and move the extruder to make sure it's moving in the right direction. And it appears to be. So we should be in good shape to move to the next step. Now I'm just going to home all again. And then I'll do the motors off button and just run around the bed manually, since we have that Z in stop, and do a quick level. Nothing new, just the usual paper test. So we're almost ready to do our first Klipper test print, but we have to deal with one more thing, and that's how the slicer is set up. You're going to need start and end G code just like you would in any other firmware. But Klipper, they intend for you to get things done inside of macros. That's because some of the syntax that Klipper uses might not be all that useful inside some slicers. It would be just better to encapsulate it in a macro, send that command over to the printer, and then let Klipper figure out the rest. So that's what we're going to set up now. And again, Klipper has great documentation, and their GitHub page, there's a lot of examples. So you can get sample macro examples over here, and you can just use these in your configuration. Bare bones, we're going to need start print and end print, what the printer does when it starts and when it ends. But there's a lot of others down here that you can use. So what I recommend is just taking these blocks of code right here, and we'll just copy these, Control-C, and head back to Mainsail. So you could put these in your Printer.cfg, but most of the macros in Mainsail are actually in Mainsail.cfg. And since they're included in your Printer.cfg, you could put them in either. I think it's a little cleaner to add them to Mainsail. Depending on how you like to set yours up, I like to keep my files in a little bit of orderly fashion. I'll just put it in the macros section. In fact, we'll put it at the beginning. Right above the first one here, cancel print, we'll just paste those examples in. And if we take a look at start print, they're using some variables to set the bed temp. The default is 60, and the default for the extruder temp is 190. Now you can see some usual G-code commands. Not all G-code is supported by every firmware, but M140, G90, these are very common ones that they all do support pretty much. But then you see they're using an actual command, a literal command to set your Z offset if you were to have to do that. So keep in mind there are differences in between these. Not everything is going to work inside Klipper. But then you have a standard G28 where you'd like to park the nozzle, move it towards the bed. If you're going to do a prime line, all of that would go in here. So you're going to have to do some tweaking with that. But then in the end print, pretty much the same kind of thing you're used to seeing. Turn off the heaters, turn off the fans. You can move the filament back up, raise the nozzle, whatever you want, disable the steppers, all that good stuff, but do it inside these macros so it's easier for Klipper to use it. So with that, we can save and restart. So then in your profile, all you have to do is run those macros to run all of those commands. So in your start G code, just replace all of that with start_print. And then in G code, you guessed it, end_print. And then Klipper will know what to do. So I'll just save my profile. And now we can use this to slice our files to send to our Ender 3 with Klipper on it. So with that, we'll just bring in our Benchy for slicing. You can automatically get this to send it over to Mainsail. If you go to Printer Settings, and then up here from Prusa Slicer, you hit the cog, you can just select Octoprint and then put in your Mainsail address. Mainsail.local, and you can hit test, and the connection works correctly. Notice we didn't have to put anything in the API key. It should be able to connect directly. So you're good there. So just hit OK, and we can create a name for the physical device. Let's just call it Ender 3v2 Klipper, and we'll just save for good measure. Now if you go back to the platter, you can slice and send that on over to Mainsail. We'll just upload for now. I'll show you over on the Mainsail side. Back to Mainsail, G-code files, there's our Benchy file. And from here you can just click on it to start the print job. After the print started, you can see our bed is coming up to temp. Once the bed has reached its desired temperature, then the hot end will start to heat up. It is also performing the home. Once those initial temperatures have been satisfied, 190 and 60, that's the end of your start print macro. Now the actual G-code from the slicer will take over. You see it just jumped to 215. That's what was set inside the slicer. And now we're off and printing. So there's a very quick walkthrough of how to get your Printer.cfg file set up and your start and end macros so you can start printing. But you're going to want to take it just a little bit further. For instance, a prime line of some kind to make sure your hot end's primed ready to print. I like to put that in my start macro. But you might want to mix it up. You're going to have to play around with a few things like that. But outside of just the vanilla install, let's go take a look at the config file a little bit closer, just so I can show you where some references are going to be if you have to make one of these from scratch. So here's a great place to start. Your config_reference.html over on the Klipper site. This is going to give you an example and some syntax of everything that you could possibly add in your Printer.cfg file. But if you just scroll through here, it can be pretty intimidating. If you're not used to this type of syntax or how it does things, there's a lot of reading to do, but it is all here. It is possible for you to get one of these done even if you don't know anything about it. So this is your first place to go. But I do highly recommend that you start with some type of example. Back to your configuration examples, at the very least, no matter if you have a Cartesian, Core XY, Core XZ, Delta, there's going to be one in here that is somewhat similar to pretty much every 3D printer out there. Not saying there won't be a ton of config that you have to do, but at least it's a place to start. You have all the syntax in place, you can just make updates. But let's just take a brief look at our current Printer.cfg so I can kind of give you the lay of the land. So some of it's pretty self-explanatory. Now the pin locations can be pretty tricky. You kind of have to work backwards on some of these boards using a schematic. Hopefully you have a board that the manufacturer has put a lot of the documentation out there. So that might take just a little bit of work to get the pins figured out. But after you have that, a lot of this just makes sense. Also, I wanted to point out you're going to see exclamation points and these carets. If you go back to that reference, it explains some of the syntax for you. The pin names are usually where you're going to see this. Exclamation point indicates reverse polarity. So like it says here, if you have to trigger low or high, like you're setting an end stop. And then the caret is a pull-up resistor, if you need to enable one of those. You also have support with pull down on some boards. That is the tilde. So keep that in mind first. But just for example, all these steppers are going to be the same. Here's your Z stepper. You can see the dir pin has an exclamation point. That means it's going to turn in the opposite direction. So just like flipping the cable on the old school boards, that's how you get it to turn the opposite way. Be aware too, they do call out microsteps for these motors, just like you're used to, but they also go by rotation distance. You're going to have to keep that in mind when setting one of these up. It uses it just a little bit differently than it would like in Marlin, where you're setting the steps. So check that out in the reference. Extruder is fairly similar, but it also uses things like nozzle diameter. You can set that up, as well as filament diameter. And in Extruder, you will set up your hot end thermistor. All the different thermistor names will be in the reference as well. You can pick how PID is controlled. all your PID settings. There is a tune, just like there would be in another firmware. That's in the reference. Bed is set up the same way. There's a section for fan pins, whether you have multiples. Your MCU, we saw that before. Mainly calling out what the device address is, how it talks to the Pi. And then very general printer configs. Kinematics, your max velocities, accelerations, all that kind of good stuff. This is a very simple config file. But again, you have to start somewhere. I just wanted to give you a bit of the lay of the land and where you can go to get help if you need it. And our Benchy's already up and printing. How about a quick time lapse? And here's a look at our first Klipper Benchy. Not too bad for a first run on a new firmware that hasn't really been tuned. There are some imperfections. It is an Ender 3 all in all, but we can make it better, I'm sure. So there we go. It took us 3 videos, but we are officially up and printing on Klipper firmware. And I wanted to go through all the steps just so you know what is all involved in using Klipper effectively. And we have just scratched the surface. There's so many more directions we could go here. There's a lot of different features in Klipper. All of them have to be set up in your configuration file, but we can walk through those and digest them one at a time. The next one will be, as I said before, auto bed leveling. So hopefully this was helpful for a lot of you. That is it for today, and I'll see you really soon on the next one.